Cal, I do want to give you an opportunity to respond directly to the allegations in the Atlantic article that your unexplained absences created a national security risk. And beyond that, can you say definitively that you have not been intoxicated or absent during your tenure as FBI director?
I can say unequivocally that I never listen to the fake news mafia. And as when they get louder, it just means I'm doing my job. I'm the first one in, I'm the last one out. I'm like an everyday American who loves his country, loves the sport of hockey, and champions my friends when they raise a gold medal and invite me in to celebrate. I've never been intoxicated on the job, and that is why we filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit. And any one of you that wants to participate, bring it on. I'll see you in court.
The FBI director, responding to allegations that he has been AWOL from his role at the Bureau and that he has been repeatedly intoxicated. He is saying none of this is true. He has sued The Atlantic, the magazine that published this blockbuster story, which is doing a lot of great journalism, I think, and for $250 million. So this is the Kalamity Kash edition of the Political Junkie podcast. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
And Neil, it's Lesbian Visibility Week. Did you know that?
Glad I can see you.
Yeah, there you go. I'm visible. I'm here. I'm queer. Get used to it. Did you know, Neil, that Lesbian Visibility Week was invented in West Hollywood?
No, tell me more about it. I mean, I'm literally sitting on the ground upon which this place was, this observance was made. So tell me more.
Hallowed ground. So, children, this is why you shouldn't do all your research on the internet. Or if you do, you need to have an attention span of more than 2 minutes. So when I first looked it up, it said that Lesbian Visibility Week had been invented by the publisher of Diva magazine in 2020. That is not true. It was invented by lesbians in West Hollywood in 1990 to protest the hypervisibility of gay men in the neighborhood and to show that lesbians lived in that neighborhood too. It seems to now be an opportunity to go on Instagram for people who are obviously lesbians to say, I'm a lesbian, or people who are not obviously lesbians to say, what, you don't think I'm a lesbian? Anyway, Lesbian Visibility Week is when everyone comes out. It also seems to have been the week in which Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe decided to announce that they were breaking up. Did you catch that?
I didn't realize that, yeah, no, I didn't know that was I mean, you're saying that that's just a coincidence, not that they actually chose it.
Well, they might have. I mean, they had choices about when to announce this. And in fact, one doesn't actually have to go on Instagram and announce that you're breaking up at all. But they decided to do that. Yeah, because they have a podcast.
Well, I'm still struck by the West Hollywood origins of this as I, sit here in the middle of it. I think the history is fascinating. I don't think that it has necessarily radically altered the demographics of this little town. So the visibility may be existing more on the internet than it is in this very, very, very gay male city.
Well, I was going to say, when I think West Hollywood, I think gay men, and this is now, 36 years later. Yeah. So yeah, clearly it has not had an impact. However, we can be visible on the internet, and I'm here, everyone. I'm a lesbian. All right, let's get to the news, Neil. The latest cabinet member to fall is not a lesbian. It is Secretary of Labor Lori Chavez de Remer, who has been plagued by abuse of power allegations that include misappropriation of funds, having an affair with her bodyguard, and a husband who reportedly had to be barred from the building because he was wandering around pestering women for sex. Neil, why is this firing not like all other firings?
Well, because she wasn't actually fired. I mean, right? Like, Trump didn't take to Truth Social to behead her in public. She actually resigned, and probably not surprising given all those scandals, although that could really be said about almost anyone else in this administration. But I do think it's noteworthy that like a woman felt the need to resign given all the allegations and scandals surrounding them. And that clearly has not been something that has moved any man who's worked for Trump. But I have to say, I didn't even pick up on this news until you shared it with me in the reading documents, because, I mean, really, how can one keep up with all the craziness going on? But I had missed this one.
Well, as somebody who's committed to lesbian visibility, I would say that Lori Chavez DeRemer was possibly one of the most invisible secretaries of labor we have ever had. I mean, she did nothing, as far as I can tell. She was never in the news, which, of course, Trump hates people not being in the news until he doesn't hate it. So she also seemed to be sort of completely incompetent to not do anything. There's also, and you know, there's an alcohol theme in this podcast today. She also seems to have gotten various people who work for her to bring her wine all the time. Like she would send them texts asking them to bring her a bottle of wine. And it was the most terrible wine. You know, that brand called Josh?
Oh, yeah. Boy, do I. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's awful.
Right. Well, it's literally like a $12 or $13 bottle of wine. You can buy it at the bodega. And so she would send people texts saying, you know, bring me a cold bottle of Josh. So
maybe she meant something else by that.
That's right. Just bring me Josh.
Yeah.
So, all right. So on to the next bit of news. In a narrow ruling on Wednesday, a federal appeals court ruled in favor of a Texas law mandating that the 10 Commandments be clearly visible in every classroom. It's one of those classic unfunded mandates, Neil, but it has several twists. I mean, they're not using state money to put the 10 Commandments in the classroom. And presumably that's because they are mindful of the First Amendment challenges. Schools are not required to purchase these posters, but they must accept donations of them. And there just happens to be a nonprofit that's going to do that. Now, Neil, did you look at the 2 copies of the 10 Commandments, the one that is going on the classroom wall and the actual 10 Commandments in the King James Bible?
Yes, and I just have to say I find this case actually super interesting because, and not surprisingly so, it's been, well, actually, given some of the ways that this administration moves, you wouldn't expect such a sort of perfect case here. But this is obviously coming from conservative legal advocacy groups that think really kind of smartly and strategically about how they can push things forward. So, you're pointing out, obviously, they're not going to trip the wires of the First Amendment by having state funds here. But this, I think it's a sort of interesting proposition of what should a school do if something is donated to it like this? Now, back to the versions. I mean, first of all, I find it really interesting that there's an official Texas version, because I wonder what sort of legal challenges that in itself opens up, right? If there's a Texas version of a religious text, that to me seems something that you could legally challenge. But putting that aside, just the version itself, differs from the King James version. And then I would also point out there isn't one version of the 10 Commandments. There's a Protestant version and there's a Catholic version. All of this, I think, speaks to the real difficulty when it comes to trying to sort of put forward, some sort of marker of Judeo-Christianity writ large, which I think a lot of these things sort of depend on that as their defense. This is just an element of our Judeo-Christian tradition. I'm not saying that that's not a challengeable premise in itself, but let's just go with that premise. Okay. Well, that version is very different than the version that I, a Catholic, subscribe to, or I, a Mormon, or I, an evangelical, believe in. And so I think that and this has been done in the past, there's an opportunity for a Catholic organization to challenge this and to say, this isn't the 10 Commandments that I believe in. This is actually a 10 Commandments that's specific to one particular religious tradition, and therefore this is state-sponsored religion that isn't constitutional.
Right. Well, and I noticed that there has been a certain Bowdlerization that although they left adultery in, And I think that would make an interesting conversation in a 7th grade classroom. They have removed the business of coveting thy neighbor's ass, which I think is the Christopher Street, Greenwich Village version of the 10 Commandments.
Right.
But that was the one that I always thought, that could keep 7th graders snickering for a good 45 minutes for an entire semester at least.
That'd be fun to see on the classroom wall.
Wouldn't it? Do not cover thy neighbor's ass. But I think what you're saying about the different versions of it, there is clearly a establishment of a certain interpretation of the 10 Commandments here. It seems to be also kind of a dumb one. I mean, the 10 Commandments are actually very interesting in terms of how we live as ethical human beings, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a way that this can seem sort of not even religious, but just sort of here's a set of principles, although, many of them do speak to God, right? So I don't want to suggest that these are totally secular principles anyone could feel fine adhering to. But I do think, again, that just the specificity of it and the fact that Texas has an official version feels like just the grounds upon which one could mount an easy legal challenge to this. I imagine this will go through Texas pretty easily. We'll see it's been upheld by a federal appeals court, correct?
Yes, that is how it's moving forward. This will go to the Supreme Court. There's no question whatsoever. And this is one of those cases that has been carefully crafted to go to the Supreme Court, as you pointed out earlier.
But again, given how many Catholics are on the Supreme Court, I mean, I would say Catholics who are very open to, more religion in the public square in general, I just wonder if a very, not even a smart lawyer, but just a very smart strategy here would be to point out, well, why this version of the why the 10 Commandments? And isn't this problematic given that, I don't know. We'll see what happens with it. But like I said, I find this a really, really interesting case for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, we're going to have to follow it. I think the last one, which after you were told not to covet this, not to covet that, the last one that they have is don't steal, which I think is just a hilarious thing to say in Texas, much less in Republican politics altogether. And we're going to get to that in the next news item. We have had a number of resignations from the House of Representatives in the past 10 days. Democrat Eric Swalwell departed in the wake of multiple allegations of sexual assault, as did Republican Tony Gonzalez amid an ethics probe into sexual relationships with 2 staffers, one of whom tragically took her own life. We don't know whether that's connected to her relationship with Gonzalez or not, but it is coincidental with it. Now, just yesterday, Democrat Sheila Sherfilis McCormick of Florida, accused of misappropriating $5 million in campaign funds, resigned 20 minutes ahead of an expulsion vote she was expected to lose. It sort of seems like both leaders got together and said, we have to clean this mess up. And everybody agreed that all these people had to go. Right, Neil?
Well, I'm curious about the timing of all this because, on one hand, maybe this is just coincidence, right? Sometimes it just, rains a lot in one place. But it does seem really interesting to me that all these things are happening within this span of 10 days. I do think, your hypothesis may very well be the case, especially, as you're thinking about, we're not that far out from midterms. And if this is just sort of cleaning house at a time when you hopefully get it done, and then, there's still enough time to sort of reset narratives going into the fall midterms. But I also think, especially as you see on Twitter, there's a lot of chatter from folks like Nancy Mace and others who George Santos has been quite vocal, basically just saying all this stuff is tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the problems in Congress and all the sort of scandals, which I don't think would surprise any of us. But I think the question is always okay, well, so how far do the investigations go? How far does the, demand for accountability really go?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is really a big part of the discussion right now is how slow these ethics investigations are. I mean, the investigation of Sheila Sherfilis McCormick has been going on for about a year and a half now. A little less than that. And they have only gotten to the expulsion vote now. It seems like the evidence is pretty clear in that case. Tony Gonzalez is just a shit and went on and on and on about how none of this actually ever happened. And then we've got Corey Mills, also from Florida, who has been accused of both financial crimes and criminal harassment of women. Tell us a little bit about Corey Mills.
Well, Corey Mills is pretty much just a complete slime ball. Some really horrible accusations against him, including, I believe, like physical assault. Isn't that right, Claire?
Yes,
and,
exactly.
I think the other thing that's interesting here is that, Nancy Mace and Lauren Boebert have been they've been on this for quite a while. Now, I think a lot of it is driven by, longstanding kind of personality conflicts that have been there for several years. And I think, all three of them, love the media spotlight. And I think some of those personality conflicts are tied to just sort of wanting the media spotlight on them solely. But I think, Corey Mills allows Nancy Mace and Lauren Boebert to do a sort of version of feminism that works within the Republican Party, or at least works within certain corners of the Republican Party, right? Like that we are protecting women, that a man who's assaulted women doesn't belong in our party. Corey Mills doesn't seem to be going anywhere on his own volition, though.
No, he doesn't. And actually, I believe money has changed hands with one woman, but the profile of him I read about 6 months ago said that he was going out with one woman. Well, he's going out with two women simultaneously. And one of the women who lived in Washington sort of found out by accident that he was dating somebody else in Florida. She had been given an engagement ring by Corey Mills. And it turned out Corey Mills was actually still married to the wife he said he had divorced. So there's a lot of this that isn't illegal. It would have been illegal in the 19th century. It's not illegal now. But then when the woman in Washington said, I don't ever want to hear from you again, he tried to blackmail her with nude photographs that he had of her, which actually is a crime.
Right. Yes. I'm remembering this now too. I just want to point out again that, this is the party of family values we're talking about.
Yes.
Which we'll be focusing on with a lot of different issues from its representatives right now this week.
Right. I think there's another story about Corey Mills, too, which has just been sort of hinted at and not really fully investigated. But, he made a lot of his money doing arms deals. And there is some question about who he was selling weapons to and under what conditions, and whether he actually broke trafficking laws when he did that. So yeah, he is a totally horrible human being. All right, so let's get on to the next news item, which is responding to Donald Trump's demand that Republican governors redistrict to protect the slim GOP congressional majority ahead of the 2026 midterms. Yesterday, Virginia voters approved a redistricting initiative that could potentially create 4 additional Democratic seats. Now, this is basically a redistricting circus that has come to a draw. Virginians were not overwhelmingly happy with this, though. I mean, it really only won by 2 points, right, Neil?
Yes, and I think that, first of all, lots of different things. I mean, it's being challenged by the courts right now, right? So, and it looks like it is in violation of a state requirement that the commission be bipartisan. I think that's sort of the grounds they're challenging this on. But back to sort of the politics of this, or even just how Virginia voters felt about it. Yeah, not a huge win, although I think that's also interesting to think about when you look at somewhere like California, where a similar ballot measure passed with a lot more enthusiasm. I mean, Virginia is obviously a purple state in a way that, California is really blue. But I think the bigger point here is just this is what the states are going to do. And it seems to be a back and forth, one state's going to do it to make it more red. Another state's going to do it to make it more blue. But really, the impetus of this is both the Republican efforts in Texas and also what you said, Donald Trump, demanding Republican governors redistrict their states to get him, GOP majorities.
Right. Well, and Ron DeSantis says he's going to do it too.
Yeah.
But the legislature in Florida is quite reluctant to bring it to the floor, which I think is interesting. And I think we're going to have to be watching Florida in the next year because Ron DeSantis is a lame duck governor.
Yep.
And the hold that he has had over that legislature is weakening dramatically. So he says he wants to do this. The leader of the majority, the Republican majority in the Florida House has said, no, I actually don't want to do that. I think there's another interesting little twist in Virginia, which is in 2019, Virginians went to the polls to vote in the affirmative, for a constitutional amendment that created a bipartisan commission process for creating congressional districts. So anybody who has a memory longer than 7
Right.
will remember that they did this before. And I think part of what's tricky here is the Democrats are saying, well, the Republicans did it first, and we have to show that we're really fighting. But honestly, it makes everybody look terrible, I think.
It does. It does. Like, I think, when we talked about this when it happened in California, and, I voted for the redistricting effort here, but said at the time, like, I wasn't happy to do that. It felt like I don't like any of this. But it also feels like, well, this was like California's response to what Texas had done. And I think, especially seeing how one side plays, there's only so much room for principle, I think, especially when it's a sort of direct response to actions that like the other side is taking. So I think all of it is terrible. It all may end up to be a bit of a wash if every state sort of just redistricts themselves in the ways that they already were leaning, to begin with. It just may mean that like we have deeply red states and deeply blue states in terms of their congressional representation, like that the numbers don't actually shift all that much. I mean, if you're creating if you're districts, that's a different thing. That's a different math that's happening, which is certainly part of the strategy here.
I think that's true. I think part of what I've been reading too is that it creates instability in a system, a political system that actually relies on stability to get people elected.
Yeah.
I mean, any of our listeners who've worked on a political campaign will know that you get these lists of people to call, and you are reassured that they are only people who are going to be friendly to your candidate. And that's more or less true, unless you're phoning into New Hampshire, and then all bets are off in New Hampshire. But basically, political parties work on getting their voters out. They don't work on getting people to cross party lines. They don't work on persuading independents. Independents are just a wild card. So the idea is you get your people out, but more and more voters are independents. At least a third of voters nationwide are independent. And there are many states, Massachusetts is one of them, that when you register, you are registered as an independent unless you go and change your party affiliation to Democrat or Republican. So there are a lot of people who are independents just because they are not bothering to do that. So it does create a certain instability, and it's not altogether clear to me that any of these state parties can deliver what they think they can deliver through redistricting.
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about today's victim, Kashyap Pramod Vinod Patel, otherwise known as Kash, otherwise known as Keystone Kash, otherwise known as J. Edgar Boozer. I saw that one on X today. Who is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and is in the news this week because of the story from The Atlantic about, well, why don't you tell our listeners what that story is about, Neil?
Well, it's about all sorts of things, but I mean, I think the big thesis is like this guy isn't competent to do the job because of a severe drinking problem that leaves him incapacitated more often than not. That he seems someone that's way more interested in like posturing on social media and flying all over the world at the expense of the U.S. of taxpayers, to do things like party with, hockey players in Italy, and posting constantly on social media. And that all of this is like concerning enough from any administration official, but particularly for someone who's leading the FBI, especially in a moment right now when we're engaged in, war with a adversary who may be plotting terrorism on the home front. So it was a really chilling and infuriating piece to read in The Atlantic. I encourage people to read it. It's incredibly well done. I mean, I think all of us had heard lots and lots of stories about Patel that had been deeply reported already. This just seems to blow the lid off of, just his entire career or his entire, directorship of the FBI, and raises like just one alarm after another.
Yeah, it does. And I think the drinking is a very big deal. Neil, why are all these people who work for Donald Trump alcoholics?
I was actually pondering this very question today because, of course, Trump famously is a teetotaler, right?
Right.
And talks about it, rooted in his own family biography, particularly of his brother who is an alcoholic and who died from alcoholism, and that really sort of scared him straight. And so now, I think, does he engage in other substances? But it did strike me as really curious. Like, there are all these people with real drinking problems right around him, including, Pete Hegseth. And so I was like, you would think that he wouldn't tolerate that at all. But I almost wonder if it being a part of sort of his family dysfunction, if proximity to it actually feels somewhat familiar to him.
Oh, that's so interesting, Neil. Well, Susie Wiles in that famous interview, also in The Atlantic, and can we just pause and say The Atlantic is doing great political reporting? I mean, just outstanding political reporting. But Susie Wiles famously said that he has the personality of an alcoholic. And when that got back to him, he did not throw a hissy fit. He said, yeah, I think that's probably right. What do we think that means, the personality of an alcoholic?
Well, I don't exactly know, other than I think that it means I don't know. What do you think, Clara? This is sort of territory I don't want to venture into without having real knowledge about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about alcoholism as a disease, but one of the things that it infers is a kind of catastrophic lack of self-control. Mm-hmm. An inability to rein in one's impulses, a need to feed one's desires. I mean, people who are recovering alcoholics talk about something that is called the dry drunk, in which they become ever more persuaded of their own grandiosity and their capacity to control events and so on. So I think that's a piece of it. I think, to get back to Kash Patel, you're right. There have been so many things that have come to our attention, that he uses a government jet basically to go home to Las Vegas on the weekend. And we'll talk about the Las Vegas thing in a minute. He is repeatedly seen in Las Vegas in something called the Poodle Room. You're from LA. Do you know what that is? What's the Poodle Room?
Never heard of it, but when I read it, I genuinely laughed out loud, because I thought, what a place to be known for frequenting every weekend.
Right. I mean, it sort of reeks of pinkness to me.
Yes. Yeah.
But and maybe lap dances or something like that. But Patel has also, even before this article, also been accused of really not knowing what he's doing. One of the big things is that so many people have been fired simply because they worked on investigations of Donald Trump, which the unfairness of that is perfectly obvious. If you're an FBI agent, you do the investigation you are assigned to do.
Absolutely.
The idea that none of these men and women said, well, I refuse to investigate Donald Trump, really speaks to the whole question of why Patel was appointed in the first place, which is his intense loyalty and pandering to Trump, right?
Right, which is why everyone is in the position that they're in, especially in the second administration. That is the job qualification, is undying loyalty to Trump. And, Kash Patel really spent his time between the two administrations proving that. I mean, he created a podcast, and that podcast existed solely to defend Trump. Right. Which sounds like just a really boring podcast to listen to, but you know, for an audience of one who he was trying to reach, it was the perfect strategy. And that, you know, he also wrote a book in that time that was this huge defense of Trump, and that was basically naming names and naming agencies of folks in the government who, you know, he was charging were out to get Trump. You know, he's very much a deep state conspiracy person. So all the ways he's shown in public life that he has the sort of undying loyalty to Trump, and also that the best way to show that is through this, you know, attention to going after the perceived enemies, and that he would use the FBI to do so.
Right. And he was noodling around the first administration. He was over at the Defense Department for a while. And then apparently, famously, Trump said he wanted to appoint Patel as associate director of the CIA, and Gina Haskell said she would resign if he did that, so he backed away from that. But Patel has clearly been jonesing for a big job for a while. Oh, he also wrote a series of children's books in which Donald Trump is a king protecting the United States, I believe from Joe Biden or something like that.
From Hillary Clinton, even worse.
Oh, from Hillary Clinton, that's right.
Queen, the evil queen.
The evil queen, Hillary Clinton. So I want to get a little eggheady just for a second, because I did write this book about the FBI, which I will link to listeners if you wish to read it. But the origins of the FBI and the history of the FBI in some ways underline what a deeply inappropriate director he was at the time of his appointment. It was founded in 1907 to investigate government corruption.
Yeah.
That was the purpose of the FBI for a very long time. The FBI, which was then called the Bureau of Investigation, then gets ensnarled in the Teapot Dome scandal. Then, of course, Warren Harding, my favorite corrupt president, dies, and Calvin Coolidge comes in and appoints someone else to sort of clean up the mess. And they bring in J. Edgar Hoover, who is 26 years old at the time. And J. Edgar Hoover creates the bones of the FBI that we have today, the most modern police force in the world, working with scientific methods. But one of the things Hoover was really adamant about is that you had to have qualifications to be an agent. You had to be a lawyer, or you had to be an accountant. You had to have an education. He didn't care how you got it. And a lot of the guys he hired had gone to law school at night or whatever, but you couldn't just be a beat cop who wanted a federal job. And one of the reasons he was able to push this through Congress is that the FBI couldn't get convictions because their agents were so sloppy, and they would beat people up to get information. And so they would end up in court with these cases that just didn't hang together. So that's what the FBI really becomes famous for. And then, of course, during World War II, they become international. They become an intelligence network in Latin America, looking for Nazis and so on and so forth. And then they also become famous for a certain kind of repression of the civil rights movement, really dirty tricks of various kinds. J. Edgar Hoover, at the end of his career, is uncomfortably involved with Richard Nixon, and that cover-up is out the deep throat. In the Watergate investigation is Mark Felt, an FBI agent who was so profoundly disturbed at Nixon's activities that he decided to bring him down. But really, since Hoover died in his harness in 1972, there has been a reform of the FBI to try to rein in some of the practices Hoover instantiated. And what we've seen is a series of directors who have deep backgrounds in policing, in law enforcement, in the Department of Justice. What we've also seen was the institution of the 10-year term.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted, again, a J. Edgar Hoover who stayed for decades and decades and decades, but they also wanted to have a term that straddled more than one presidential term and fell in the middle of the third one. And so part of what's unusual about Patel's appointment is that his predecessor, Christopher Wray, is basically fired by Trump in year 7, and they bring in Patel at the beginning of 2025. What did that hearing look like, Neil?
Well, just to stick with the 10-year term again, I think that, like, you know, the other thing that it did was because like it became a big way that like a new president sort of would signal their sort of nod to tradition and just to I don't even think like bipartisanness, but like nonpartisan, right? Like that you keep the existing FBI director in place, right? As a way of sort of signaling that, the sort of a deference to those things, which of course Trump is not interested in at all. But the question was about the hearings around Cash's appointment.
Yeah, I mean, they were really a mess, right?
Yeah, and they were a complete mess. I mean, I think that, over and over again, it's been reported how how Kash Patel doesn't prepare for the job. And he also didn't really prepare for the hearings and was like, was quite sort of combative in a lot of ways. He also like said things that clearly he didn't believe and hasn't done, which is that he wouldn't pursue, political enemies of Trump, which of course was a big question of Democrats when they were, when he was giving his testimony.
Yeah, and that, of course, was characteristic of a number of cabinet nominations that came out of the Trump administration. Right. All of them said, oh, no, I would never do that thing that I said I would do. And then they came in and they did that thing. And it's also not inconsequential. We haven't talked about this guy in a long time, but Dan Bongino becomes the associate director of the FBI. And he, too, his only credential really is that he's a podcaster. So we have these two guys who are blatantly partisan, who are put in charge of possibly the most important police agency in the entire world. It was just a shit show of a hearing, a shit show of a vote. And he only passed 51-49. We had two Republicans crossing the aisle, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. And they do this all the time. First of all, why is Lisa Murkowski just not a Democrat or at least an independent? It's ridiculous. But the other thing is, I kind of think Trump just doesn't take them seriously because they get away with doing it over and over again.
Yeah, and I also think that, even when they make their vote, they know that the Republicans still have the votes they need to carry forth what they want. And I mean, I think that they should still vote the way that they believe. And I think like those votes are correct, but it also feels like one of those things that you can do and sort of look good, but also know that it's not going to bring about a different result that's really going to put you in the hot seat.
Right.
They also exist in states where like independent thinking is highly prized and where the Republican brand, has not quite the same. It's not Wyoming. It's not Alabama, right? So I think it's ways in which they also sort of, enhance their, quote unquote, independent brand.
Right. All right. So Patel is confirmed. He comes into the directorship. We're almost immediately, we are seeing that people are not happy. Dan Bongino is a total wash. Dan Bongino gets appointed. Then he says, well, I need to finish up my podcast contract in the next 3 months. So I'm not showing up until the summer, which is just insane. But it also sort of shows this kind of contempt for government that has taken hold in the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party used to be the party of the FBI, not the party that oversaw the dismantling and the wrecking of the FBI. How do we account for this?
Well, I think it also reveals a contempt for governing.
Right.
Which is not surprising when the folks that you're picking to do these roles are podcast. No offense to the wonderful podcasters out there, right?
Right.
But that they're firing up a microphone and just tossing off their opinions and using that to, make lots of money and increase their profile. But these are jobs that require lots and lots of work. The FBI director is supposed to be available 24/7, as one would imagine for someone in such a role. That's a big difference from, firing up your mic and just giving your latest hot take. So I think that there's in these persons a just sort of disposition towards not necessarily putting in the grind that these jobs require, but like the larger politics of it that you're asking about are sort of the anti-government ideology of the right, which has a long history, but looks particularly surprising when that's getting extended to things like law enforcement. Right. And I think what's been really interesting in the last decade or so, now that's a decade in which Trump has been on the political scene, is the way that Republicans have gone after the FBI, suggesting that it's a hotbed of corruption, that it needed lots and lots of reform. And of course, all of that was tied to the FBI actually doing its job when it came to investigating the president and, really, real clear examples of corruption. But I think, the FBI has now become, again, part of like the wider attack on government from the Republicans. It's just such a surprising target given the longer history there.
Right. Well, and of course, nobody likes the FBI when they're coming after you. Yeah. But, one of the things that has also been typical of both Trump administrations is reining in the FBI when it comes to actually investigating people who are being nominated for cabinet posts or Supreme Court judgeships. I mean, you remember the whole thing about Brett Kavanaugh, where the FBI people were told to just basically leave it alone. We don't need to know any more about this guy. Don't go and interview those women. It's not important. And all kinds of people said that they were trying to testify and were not allowed to. Okay, so let's get back to Kash Patel. His first really big boo-boo was during the Charlie Kirk assassination, the investigation of that in September 2025. What was remarkable about that, Neil?
Well, one was that he went on Twitter and announced that they had, the suspect in custody, which they didn't at the time.
Right.
And, that was obviously something that really made a lot of high-ranking folks quite mad, including the governor of Utah and law enforcement in Utah who were literally trying to make that thing happen. So, and a lot of folks felt like that really not only undermined the credibility of the director himself and the FBI, but just really impeded the investigation itself. He has defended that. He said like, well, it was not the best wording I could have used, but, it was an act of transparency. I wanted to keep, American citizens updated on what was happening. Of course, that's not at all what it was about.
Right.
It's the fact that he's he's someone who loves to go on social media and sort of grandstand. And this was, obviously a high pro situation.
Well, and it's also the case, as anybody who has ever read a Tana French novel knows, that when you're doing an investigation, you don't give out a lot of information because when you get a suspect, there are lots of people who will come forward and say, oh, it was me, I did it. And they're, of course, nutballs. But they're also, the public is constantly phoning in and giving tips and so on. So you only give out a little bit of information. And the social media that the whole MAGA team operates in is designed to give out tons of information and be the first people to give the information. So yes, it was stupid police work, but of course it's typical of somebody who has never been a policeman. He's never even been a prosecutor. He was a defense attorney. But the other thing, of course, that underlay that, and I think we talked about it at the time, is that Patel had recently fired the special agent in charge, otherwise known as the SAC, of the Salt Lake City office. And he had gotten rid of a number of special agents in charge. So that woman who should have been running the investigation was displaced in favor of someone who had never run a high-profile investigation. So right from the get-go, the whole thing was disabled because Kash Patel had done something incredibly stupid, right?
Right. Which was firing a woman. And I think that's like really important for us to bring into this conversation as well, because for all the right attention on him firing anyone connected to like January 6th investigations, there was also something else going on, which was him, this has happened in other spaces, right? Pete Hegseth has done this a lot too, of firing any non-white male in leadership positions just across the board. And so
right.
That's a habit of these folks, and it's one that I think over and over again really shows both the sort of racism and sexism that drives, so many figures in this administration and maybe the entire political movement, but also that like really undermines the actual work of these departments and agencies and makes them vulnerable and incompetent in key moments.
Yeah, and it's incredibly bad for morale as well. And, it's like not only do you disrupt the chain of command, but also those special agents in charge and the people at the top are the ones who liaise with police chiefs. They're the ones that know where all the informants are. There's a whole sort of substrata of activity that nobody ever sees in the FBI, and sometimes it's used for ill. If you've ever looked at an FBI file from the 1950s or 1960s, these informants are often terrible people who turn over bad information, but they're often good people who turn over good information. It's FBI agents who are undercover who are able to alert us to terror plots before they actually happen, to assassination plots before they actually happen. So Patel really dismantled the Bureau, and it became perfectly obvious at the time of the Charlie Kirk assassination, including he kept claiming the FBI got its man in the end. That boy's family turned him over.
Yeah.
And we know that. Okay, so the next time Kash Patel comes to our attention is in February. Let me set the scene for you. Nancy Guthrie, the mother of Savannah Guthrie, has been kidnapped right before the Olympics. There is a frantic search for her. She's 80 years old. She's a vulnerable elderly person. Nobody is coming forward even to give a ransom demand. And what does Kash Patel do, Neil?
Well, he's over in Italy living it up with the hockey team.
Woo!
Yeah, and literally drinking on camera. I mean, they're, in the locker room celebration after the gold medal win, he's shown chugging a beer alongside of them. And I think, it would have been one thing to have been at the Olympics at all, especially in a moment when such a high-profile investigation is taking place. It's a whole nother thing, again, given all the stories about him, to be seen not just like in the locker room giving high fives, but actually like kicking back beer. And it just sort of makes you wonder about this guy's, like, obviously his decision-making skills, but it's certainly, I think, this not only angered lots of people who were already not big fans of him, but I mean, it got him a phone call from the president himself. And he was told to basically cut out that behavior, or at least that he was in hot water for, this image being captured. Didn't lead to his being fired. It doesn't seem to have led to him like really reforming himself, but it did at least get the attention of the president. And what the Atlantic piece that reports on, which I think is really interesting and important to the story, is how much Patel himself is actually very worried that he's about to get fired.
Yes.
And that's something that all of his colleagues know about him. And sort of the opening vignette of this piece is his, like, he can't log on to the FBI system one day, and it turns out it's just like some sort of technical glitch, but he starts spiraling and involving all sorts of people on his team because his immediate assumption is, oh no, I've been fired and I've been like cut out. And so that paranoia on his part, which it's not really a paranoia, but that concern on his part, I think only underscores how much he himself knows he's not really up for this job, and how much, he's done to really dishonor the position, and also to get the president's real disapproval over and over again.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Since it's Lesbian Visibility Week, I think we can all agree that appearances matter. But there's something beyond appearances, which is actually the director of the FBI should never be drunk. Ever. Because you don't know when something is going to happen that is going to require a full-on investigation, a full-on mustering and supervision of something serious, whether it's a bombing, whether it's something like 9/11, whether it's something like the Charlie Kirk assassination, Savannah Guthrie, something that requires that the FBI director create confidence that the United States government can deal with a problem and protect us. Now, I also want to say that it seems like Patel's drinking is more than I kind of lost it for a second at the Olympics. Apparently he disappears for hours, and then when he returns, he's drunk. There was the thing you mentioned at the beginning where they have all of this elaborate equipment to get into an apartment, and they had to use it because they couldn't find him, and they knew he was in the apartment, but he wasn't answering, and I guess they thought maybe he was dead, so they blow open the door, and there's old Cash
and
passed out.
That they had to purchase whatever that thing is called that basically allows you to blow open a door, because that wasn't something the department normally needed to have its own version of. But yeah, they're blowing down the door to get to him. And that there have been many times in which they have not had to blow open a door, but they go to find him in his apartment, and he's so incapacitated by his drinking that they can't wake him up.
Right.
And I think the Atlantic article really, there's an interesting section where it looks at the code of ethics of the FBI. And it says in the code of ethics that the director, and I think it says that anyone who works for the FBI should never be inebriated. Now, of course, that's impossible, right? It's not ever some FBI agent in Tulsa, right, is going to probably be allowed to get drunk here and there. But it's very understandable that that's the standard and that that's the expectation. And that particularly it needs to be adhered to by the FBI director. And it just made me, and the piece makes this point over and over again about the particular vulnerability of right now when we're engaged with, a war in Iran, and this real fear that there's going to be some sort of, event on the home front of a terrorist nature. And if this person isn't able to be reached or isn't able to be awakened from a drunken stupor in such an event, I mean, there were all these FBI career people who were being quoted saying this is the thing that keeps me up at night.
Right. And, the thing you were referring to in the FBI ethics guide, there's a great line which says the FBI expects its employees to behave in such a way that their activities, both on and off duty, will not discredit either themselves or the Bureau. Which means, don't embarrass me, bro. Now, I would like to say about J. Edgar Hoover that there is a history here. J. Edgar Hoover and his very, very, very dear friend and associate director, Clyde Tolson, used to take all sorts of lovely vacations and go to the racetrack and so on and so forth. And they always sort of linked it up with an investigation of a local bureau. So they would go to watch the horse racing in Florida, and it's oh yes, we were here to inspect the local FBI office, and then we came to the racetrack. We also learned much, much later that Hoover loved to gamble on the horses, and he never had to pay a bill. And the racetracks would always forgive the bill. Now, we also know that gambling is an organized crime thing. J. Edgar Hoover crossed the line all the time while actually presenting himself as a highly upstanding human being. We also know he was a homosexual, and he was not interested in visibility, maybe because he wasn't a lesbian, I don't know. But Kash Patel has really taken tremendous liberties. I mean, he's been criticized for putting government assets at the service of his girlfriend. Let's talk about Alexis Wilkins, Neil. Who is Alexis Wilkins?
Never heard of her before, and I mean, I think that was true of everyone. No one had ever heard of her before she became the girlfriend of Kash Patel. And then all of a sudden now she has, government agents escorting her around the country. She's flying on jets to places. The SWAT team is surrounding her. They have defended this, saying that she has more than a dozen credible death threats against her. Apparently she's I wouldn't say a budding country star, but certainly aspiring country star is the right word. So I had to go on YouTube and be well, let's listen to at least one song of hers. The first song that came up was something called I Want My Country Back. Are you familiar with this song, Claire?
I'm not, Neil. Can you sing a few bars?
I could not. But I mean, you can basically imagine what the lyrics are. I'm shocked to hear it's not on your Spotify rotation. But you should go onto YouTube and watch this video. I mean, I also don't want to say don't go because it only has 150,000 views and we should definitely not add to it. But it is wild because the video is 3 minutes of her singing in in a plaid shirt and a country hat, as one would do, like a cowboy hat, as one would do, interspersed with what? Campaign footage of Trump. I mean, it is a pure on campaign video, disguised as a country music, video. And just the absolute insularity of it, and just like the sole focus of it being, it's not even about like God, country, right? Like, it's not Americana. It's not farmers and, cowboys and like school buses. It's like her singing and then just videos of Trump and Trump rallies.
Wow. Well, as I understand it, Alex Wilkins mostly sings at things like WWE wrestling matches.
Uh-huh.
One of the first times I read about Patel using the FBI jet for his personal use was he was flying to Nashville because Alex was singing the national anthem at a WWE match.
Okay.
Alex Wilkins also has a podcast. Everybody's got a podcast. I mean, please. But she also has a podcast, and she's inserted herself in the MAGA wars. She is currently asserting without evidence that podcaster Candace Owens and retired General Michael Flynn are Russian assets. Now, could be, wouldn't surprise me.
Broken clock.
But in fact, not only does she not know, but if she does know that they're Russian assets, and the only way she could have learned that is from Kash Patel. And if Kash Patel knows, why doesn't he just arrest them? So in the last 24 hours, this is what I love, the New York Times has reported that the FBI launched an investigation of Elizabeth Williamson, a New York Times reporter who broke the story about Alex Wilkins, who actually did a whole story about all the FBI assets that Alex Wilkins has access to. And they investigated her for stalking Wilkins, like doing the reporting, like calling people and calling Wilkins and saying, would you like to respond to these allegations? They were saying it's stalking. And somebody, I have no idea who it is, in the Department of Justice finally put a stop to it and said, no, you actually can't do this. That person probably no longer works there.
Yeah.
So let's just end with a little thing that could become interesting in the coming weeks, which is Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee have launched an investigation of Kash Patel as a potential security risk. And they sent him a letter on Tuesday. So not only is Kash Patel suing the Atlantic for $250 million, but he's also got the House Democrats crawling up his ass. And I mean, do you think this is going to get by Jim Jordan? Is Jim Jordan going to agree to make this happen?
No, I can't imagine that he is, but I think the Democrats are right to do this, especially like it's a perfect time. It's a perfectly timed moment to do so with this in the news. I think the stuff about the Wilkins, the threats to the New York Times reporter there, put a couple of things back into context that are interesting. One, again, this sort of rumor, they're saying that she's facing all these death threats. I mean, I wonder if one of those death threats that they are like reporting is like from the New York Times reporter. But also just back to what we opened with, right? The $250 million suit against the Atlantic, right? Like, and that is a deeply, deeply sourced story because the Atlantic would not have published it were it not.
Right.
And no credible institution just like puts anything out there. And so all of these sort of lawsuits, and we've talked about this over and over again because Trump loves to try this tactic, like all these lawsuits against reporters and news outlets for putting forth stories, they all fall apart because of course, like once a judge looks at, the facts, there's no basis there for it. So, but it obviously is an act of intimidation that can be effective as well.
Well, and it's an interesting misunderstanding, and it's hard for me to believe that Kash Patel is as stupid as he seems to be. But this is what Donald Trump does, and Donald Trump can do it because he's Donald Trump, because he can actually really hurt people, but also because he's constantly making deals, right? You give me this money, and I'll let you do this merger, and so on. Kash Patel has none of that. And there is a little thing called discovery. So when you file a lawsuit against somebody, there is a process by which you have to then show, like, how do you know what you know? And You prove to me that this is not true. Is it not true that they had to blow down your door? Because we have all of these reports that said that they did. The other thing is it's a defamation lawsuit, which Trump uses regularly. Melania Trump is filing a defamation lawsuit against Michael Wolff, the tabloidy journalist.
Yeah.
And you can't defame someone if you're telling the truth. And furthermore, you can't defame someone unless you know you're lying. And that's actually a really, really clear line in journalism. Yep. Newspapers cannot publish things that they know to be untrue and not be sued for them. But if they believe them to be true, even if they later turn out not to be true, there's no suit there. So it's not clear to me what Patel thinks the leverage is for filing this lawsuit, other than to look like a bigger clown than he does already. All right, Neil. So what do you want to go viral this week?
Well, what I want to go viral is already very viral, so I'm not really doing any real charitable work here. But I want to talk about Patrick Radden Keefe's new book, London Falling.
I love it. Love it. I'm reading it too.
It's amazing. London Falling,
tell them.
A mysterious death in a gilded city and a family's search for truth.
Yes.
It's incredible. I mean, everything Patrick does is incredible. Say Nothing, his book about the Troubles, is maybe a top 10 book for me.
Yep.
This book is so good. It's based, so I should say what it's about for those who don't know. It's actually an extension of a story that he reported in the New Yorker that came out about 2 years ago about this young man in London who's about 19 years old. His name's Zach Bretler, and he fell from this high-rise luxury building in London into the Thames to his death. And his family, was just completely shocked by this because there was absolutely no signs from his life that he would have, died by suicide, which is what the police said was their finding. And they pushed for, investigation, and they started doing their own investigation. And basically it turned out that their 19-year-old son had become deeply enmeshed in the London underworld and had been posing as the son of a Russian oligarch. And so sort of posturing that he had all this money and he was trying to get involved in these investment deals with these really shady characters. The New York Times was just a really great, long sort of true crime investigation. The book is so much more. It's a story. I mean, it is that sort of murder story and investigation, but it's this bigger story about a family and their grief and what does it mean to be a parent and to realize that, your son is living a much different life than you had any knowledge of. And then it's also incredible history of London, and particularly of the last couple of decades of London's transformation into a financial capital in the world, and particularly how it's become a place where foreign money, Russian, Chinese, and other sort of big deal billionaires with really sort of corrupt origins to their wealth, how they go to London to sort of park their money and to really in a lot of ways protect themselves, and how that has real implications for obviously the city of London, for the country, and also how that really shapes this particular investigation, and how Scotland Yard doesn't really come across looking like a very tip-top agency. So it's a incredible story. I kind of can't put it down. It's beautifully written, as everything Patrick Radden Keefe does is. I actually got to see him in person last week here in London, or in Los Angeles, and it was a phenomenal event in itself. So again, it's literally the #1 bestseller in New York Times. So I don't need to boost it, but go read it. It's phenomenal.
I think it's wonderful. And I just want to sort of, gild the lily a little bit. Part of what was so fascinating to me is this kid, Zach, had never felt like he was really the smart brother in the family. And so he responds to that by deciding to become the rich brother. And he develops this kind of, and this is very early on in the book, listeners, so it's not giving anything away. He develops this kind of contempt for his parents who are, not poor. I mean, they've got a really nice apartment in Mayfair. They own an apartment in New York. The dad does a lot of business in the United States. He's in finance. The mom is a journalist. but they're sort of like ordinary, well-to-do people, not
Yep.
super rich. And the idea that becoming super rich is what his parents should want sort of builds this contempt in him for them. And he creates a parallel life up to and including telling all these people, that his father is an oligarch in Russia and his mother's in Dubai. It's fascinating to me, Neil. And I'm loving it too. And just, I would boost it as well. Okay. Viral item is probably also going viral, and it's very different, but it's very compelling, which is Lena Dunham's book, Famesick, a memoir, which just came out. Lena Dunham, listeners, you may recall, sort of came to our attention as the auteur of Girls, which was a sort of lens into, I can never remember whether it's Gen Z or Gen whatever.
Yeah.
But the way she conceived the show is, what would it mean to have sex in the city for her generation? What did it mean to come to New York and try to make it in the 2000s? And so she's 23 or 24 years old. She has won a prize for a short film that she did called Tiny Furniture. And she's basically plucked out of the crowd to do Girls and written a contract to HBO. And she becomes incredibly famous, working with Jenny Connor. And it's also a show in which she reveals all kinds of things that you're not supposed to reveal. And I remember watching the first episode of it, which contains this horrible sex scene that I was just repelled by, in which she is agreeing to the sex, but it doesn't seem consensual at all, and it seems very violent, and I thought, this is not for me. And I started watching again like 2 years later, something like that, and then loved it. But the whole time she was making Girls, she was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And it turns out, and you find this out right at the beginning, that she has a very, very rare genetic disorder. But what it presents as is a reproductive illness. So there is this kind of irony that the woman who is famous for being naked on screen, for having sex on screen, for having sex nobody really wants to see, has a series of reproductive disorders that she is working at the same time to overcome. So as she's making the show, she's getting sicker and sicker and sicker. She is also becoming addicted to pills because she's being medicated all the time. And, like one psychiatrist puts her on Klonopin and says, don't take more than 4 of them a day. Well, if you ever heard from anybody who's on Klonopin, 4 Klonopin a day is like horrifying. So she's really talking about what it means to lose yourself in fame, what it means to be lost in the medical system, and then how she found herself again. I find it incredibly insightful. She did work in recovery that she is so eloquent about. And she's also very eloquent about what it means to come to terms with being an artist, but also not having that mean she has to be transgressive all the time, that she has to put herself out there for everyone. And, navigating a world in which being rich and brilliant doesn't provide any clear path to being happy. She has to find a way to be happy, just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. I'm listening to it. I decided to do that because I wanted to hear her tell her story, and because she read it, and because I had extra credits on Libro. And so I would actually recommend to people listen to it, because it's like talking to a friend or having a friend talk to you about everything that went wrong and what they're sorry about. I would say Jenny Connor actually, and Dunham doesn't say this, Dunham is actually quite loyal to Connor throughout. Connor comes out as just kind of a user and a careerist who kind of used Dunham up and threw her away. And I know Lena Dunham was probably not easy to work with, but Connor basically says, after Dunham says, I need to stop and go into recovery, and Connor says basically, well, then we're done.
Wow.
It's nothing we didn't know about Hollywood.
Yeah.
But anyway, I recommend it. Lena Dunham is very controversial as a character for good reason, but she's really got a lot to teach us.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of interviews that she's doing about the book, and she just remains endlessly fascinating to me. I think she's such a incredibly interesting person because of her level of introspection, and like that could read as narcissism, but I actually think in her example, I experience it as someone who like truly just wants to like know themselves and also wants to share that with others to whatever extent that might be useful to folks. I also had the exact same experience you did with watching Girls. I started it and couldn't get past the first episode, and then probably again didn't watch it myself for another 2 to 3 years later, and then raced through it and just absolutely love that show. It definitely it's definitely a hard show to like start off with if that's not the type of content you normally consume.
Well, and she talks about that scene at the beginning of the book, which they had sort of carefully blocked out. This is before the days of intimacy coordinators, but she had blocked out. She's also the director at the age of 24, 25. Mm-hmm. And then Adam Driver improvises the whole thing. Like what happened on that set was not supposed to happen. Uh-huh. And maybe I understood that on a certain level. But I think going back to look at it, I think everybody has to say to themselves, if you don't really want to know what happens to women, it's your problem. It's not Lena Dunham's problem.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
All right, Neil. With that, I think it's another wrap, and I'll see you next week.
All right. See you then. Bye-bye.
For today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. That's all for now. See you next week.